Okay, guys, so you'll want to title the notes for this Lincoln, African Americans, and the Civil War. So, what I want to talk about here is uh, Lincoln's strategy in approaching the war, starting with the first inaugural address and covering up through the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863. And I also want to talk a little bit about how his strategy resulted in the wide scale participation of African Americans in the war effort. So, to start here, and I'm sorry this is coming up all together, but at the beginning of the war, as we've already talked about, Lincoln was very, very careful to avoid making this a war solely based on slavery. In the first inaugural address that he gave in March of 1861, he outwardly says, kind of straightforward, that he is not going to attack slavery in the South where it already exists, and therefore the South has no legitimate reason for walking away from the Union. So he makes that very clear in his first inaugural address. And the tone of his second inaugural address in 1864 is going to be a total 180, very, very different. Soon after his inaugural address and the war begins, Lincoln adopts a policy called the contraband policy. And this is a result of an act that Congress passed known as the Confiscation Act. Basically, what this policy refers to is that the Union, upon the receiving of any slave that has either ran away from his master in the Confederacy or has been seized from a master in the Confederacy, then becomes Union property. They're put into Union uniforms and they're immediately put to work for the Union. And so, what this ultimately does in August of 1861 is it solidifies the slave as a piece of property. So again, Lincoln's not touching in the institution of slavery at this point, but he's actually confirming that the slaves are the property of the Union. And at the same time, he's undermining the fugitive slave laws that existed in the nation. So essentially saying that once slaves cross over into Union territory, they become Union property and can be used by the Union Army any way that they see fit. This was something that was happening even before the Confiscation Act was passed. It was happening in different parts of the Union in different ways, but Lincoln's Congress really kind of solidifies this as policy with the passage of the Confiscation Act. And most of the time, slaves that fell under the title of contraband were then used as laborers on things like Union fortification. And there were no laws that said that those slaves had to be paid. So some were and some weren't. So this is the first kind of strategy that Lincoln uses to weaken the South in regards to slavery. About a year later, in July of 1862, Lincoln and Congress shift their strategy a little bit, and the first signal of that shift is with the passage of the Militia Act. The first 2 years of the war, although the Union had won their fair share of decisive victories, it was turning out that this war was not going to be as quick or as easy as many in the North thought it was going to be. And so what Lincoln and Congress decided to start doing was actively recruiting African Americans for the Union Army. And the Militia Act reads, quote, "the purpose of constructing entrenchments or performing camp service or any other labor for which they may be found competent." And so the Militia Act is referring to African Americans in Union territory and expands the ways in which African Americans can be used in the Union. The Militia Act also specifies that those African Americans used for the war effort will be compensated. So, in other words, they'll be paid, however much less than their white counterparts. So, again, we're still seeing, as you can tell from the quote, non-combat positions. It was widely accepted in the North that African Americans would be no good for the armed forces, that they would run from battle, or that they wouldn't fight as valiantly as their white counterparts did. So we're seeing kind of northern racism there in their assumption that African Americans just aren't fit to fight. A really pivotal turning point is with the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. Antietam is classified as a Union victory, and a decisive Union victory at that. However, the Union loses a greater number of soldiers in this battle than the Confederacy. So while the Union wins a pivotal battle, takes over this particular part of the country, it comes at a cost with a huge number of losses. So what Lincoln does after the Battle of Antietam is he uses the kind of positivity that came out of this decisive Union victory to kind of push toward the abolition of slavery a little bit more. And the need to recruit more African Americans becomes apparent as these death tolls in each battle kind of creep up. And so soon after the Battle of Antietam, and by and large as a result of the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln takes yet another step towards the side of abolition, and he passes the Emancipation Proclamation. One thing I want you to take note of about the Emancipation Proclamation is that this is purely a military strategy. This is not a reflection that Lincoln has suddenly become abolitionist, but it does show us that Lincoln is starting to lean towards abolition as a way to defeat the South. So we're going to talk a lot more about the Emancipation Proclamation in class, but what you need to know is that it freed slaves in states that were in open rebellion. So in other words, Lincoln is saying that from this point forward, any slaves in Confederate states can consider themselves free and can come north to be granted that freedom. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to is the term Confederate States. The Emancipation Proclamation does not apply to slaves in the border states, only in those states that have actively seceded from the Union. And so by 1863, we see a real shift in Lincoln's strategy here in winning this war. One from refusing to acknowledge the war is about slavery and treating slaves as property to essentially emancipating or freeing slaves in the Confederate States. So let's then move on. Sorry about that, guys. Turning point in 1862. Let's then move on to the role of African Americans in the war. So as you can see, right, Union policy is gradually starting to incorporate African Americans into the war effort a little bit more. And so one of the first experiences I want to highlight is what happens to many African Americans under the Contraband Decision or the Confiscation Acts. So the Union is quickly faced with a growing number of slaves who are considered contraband. And there's not work for all of them right away. And so what the Union begins to do is establish these refugee camps. Some were established by Union officers and Union regiments. Others were actually established kind of helter-skelter by African Americans themselves. But these were places where contraband, or slaves who have escaped or been captured in battle, resided until a more permanent solution could be found. And so there were over 250 camps, anywhere from 260 to 570 refugee camps active in places like Maryland, the Carolinas, and along the Mississippi River, where African Americans went as in kind of a holding pattern until the war could be resolved. And many remained in these refugee camps until after the war was over. And so on the one hand, right, whenever we're talking about camps of this kind, we can assume that the conditions were not ideal. A lack of food, a lack of water, a lack of the basic necessities for life, certainly. And we can also assume, however, that with large groups of African Americans coming together in these camps, some of them families, entire families, that these camps became kind of one of the first communities of freedom for many of these African Americans. And so large families entered the camps, and work was being done to make sure that families that were not united became united within these camps. Land was divided among the population so that individuals had their own plots and could farm their own substance. And schools and churches were even established. Communities were built within these camps, and they really represent that first taste of freedom. And these camps became free communities for African Americans. So this is a result of the contraband decision. As we move forward, right, and Lincoln starts to adopt a more active recruitment approach to African Americans, we see more and more Black recruits being brought into the Union ranks and being brought into the North in general. It's definitely worth noting that African Americans were not treated very well in the North. Remember, not everyone in the North is an abolitionist, and even those who were abolitionists are not used to living side by side with African Americans. And so when they were incorporated into the Army via the Militia Act, we can generally say they were paid at least a third less than white men were being paid, and that they did very little in combat positions. They were mostly used for menial labor, the tasks that white people refused to do, like cleaning latrines or toilets and digging graves for those who died in battle. These are definitely tasks that didn't come with very much glory at all. When it comes time for African Americans to serve in combat units, which is going to begin here in Massachusetts, these units are segregated. They're not serving side by side white and Black infantry together. And soldiers always had to keep in the back of their minds that if you had escaped from slavery, or if you were even a free northern Black man, that if you were captured by a Confederate, you were returned into slavery. The Confederate States of America issued a statement after Lincoln and the North started using African Americans in the war effort that any slave caught would be returned to bondage. And so the stakes for serving in the war were incredibly high for African Americans, both formerly enslaved and free. But the fact that they served in such great numbers says something about the resolve and about what this war really meant to them. And so it's worth mentioning here, and guys, I'm sorry, this should read letter C, the 54th Regiment. It's worth mentioning here that the 54th Regiment, the very first all-Black African-American regiment, was located here in Massachusetts, in fact, in Boston. And at the very beginning, it was questionable whether or not this regiment would ever see combat because of the previously held notions about African Americans and war. Nonetheless, Massachusetts abolitionist governor got consent from Congress to form this regiment. He chose a white colonel, also an abolitionist, by the name of Robert Shaw, as leader of the 54th at the age of 25. And this was very common. Even all-Black regiments would not have officers who were Black. Officers would be white. And even Black soldiers who proved themselves in battle could only receive the status of uncommissioned officers. Excuse me, guys. So the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts was considered to be an experimental unit, and ended up being kind of an example that would help to change perspectives on African American participation in the North. For a while, the 54th was used as many other Black soldiers had been used for menial labor. But by May of 1863, over 1,000 men had signed up and enlisted in the 54th. 13% of those men were from Massachusetts. The rest came from other places to serve. And 30 of them, at least, based on records, were former slaves. And so this really shows kind of the eagerness, the coming together of African Americans to participate in a war that they felt may determine their future, should determine their future. The 54th essentially puts all questions of the fitness of African Americans to serve in the Army to rest. In the summer of 1863, the 54th is transferred down south into Confederate territory, to lead an attack on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. Overall, the Union doesn't take the fort right away, and over 70 men die in this attack, but the 54th fought valiantly, and it was reported as such. And they went on, the remaining members of the 54th went on to fight several more battles. So, really changing the views that African Americans would not be fit to serve. The 54th really made its mark on this war and proved that African Americans are, in fact, the equal to white men, and particularly even in the most difficult times. All right, so here's a couple of pictures of the refugee camps that I mentioned earlier. It looks here like African Americans are reading, probably from the Bible, and kind of performing some kind of service, Christian service here. And another photograph here as well of some contraband that had been seized. Notice some of the hats there, the second and third and then fifth person. They look like Union soldier hats, right? And a Union coat there as well. So these would be considered the, quote, contraband of the Confiscation Act. All right, guys, we'll talk more about Lincoln on Monday in class. I'll see you later.